Hello everybody, my name is Star, I am your friendly neighborhood go-go dancer, and today we're talking about money. Specifically, how much tips do I make and what affects that? I mainly wanted to make this video so that people who want to become a go-go dancer or people who are currently go-go dancers get a realistic idea of what someone in this job makes. Yes, it is going to vary wildly. I live in Minneapolis and I get a $50 base pay per night that I work. It is really uncommon to get a base pay at all, and oftentimes you have to pay the venue to work there. That is already different from most places, but I still want to make this video because I think this will help people get a good idea of the money that you make from this job. The other thing that I want to say before getting into everything is I don't think this is a livable wage. I know that there are people that make more than I do, and even with that, I still feel like this is not a livable wage, mainly because if you are just doing go-go dancing, you're probably only working 2, maybe 3 nights a week tops. I can only work up to 2 nights a week, and I haven't worked 2 nights a week in years now. Your schedule is completely up to other people, and even the times that you do work, it could be a slow night. You might not make as much money as you planned that week. Those are the caveats that I want to go through first. Let's get into the numbers. So for several weeks, I have been recording the amount of tips that I make, so we're not including the base pay that I make, along with various factors that I thought would possibly contribute to the amount of tips that I make. Yes, I am this big of a nerd, and I also have graphs and charts to go with all this data. This is where my Bachelor of Science really comes into play. I started recording all this data before the pandemic. During that time, I didn't write dates down, which I really wish I did. I do wish I started tracking this a lot sooner before the pandemic started, but you know, what can you do? You can't turn back time. So looking at this chart on the far left, we see the amount of tips that I make. You might be looking at this and thinking that this is not a lot of data, and it's not. I have only been tracking this for a number of weeks, and so far this year I've really only been able to work 1 day a week. I just haven't been able to get on the schedule all that often. I do plan on adding to this in the future and kind of doing this regularly every year, and I feel like the data will get more concrete, more informative as time goes on. Let's look at the different categories that we've got going on here. On the far left, we've got tips that I make, then we've got the date. After that, we've got how do I feel out of 5. I originally set up this category when I was experiencing chronic nausea. That doesn't happen to me anymore, so I feel like this category is a little bit pointless. That seems kind of harsh, but I feel like a major contributing factor to the amount of tips that I make is how I physically feel. So basically, this category is set up on how do I feel physically, ranked on a 1 to 5 scale. 5 meaning I feel perfectly fine. 1, honestly, if I feel like a 1, I'm probably not working that night. As you can see on this scale, the lowest I go is a 2, and that's because I probably went into work feeling like a 3, and as the night progressed, I kind of sunk down to a 2. Next, we've got coverage of clothing. Again, this category is a little bit pointless because at the time I was experimenting with different levels of coverage of outfits. Now I've kind of sunk into a level of coverage of clothing that I am comfortable with, and I don't really deviate too much from that. Originally for this category, I would put the coverage of clothing I have from a 1 to 3 scale. A 3 in coverage of clothing would be like a 1 piece or like something with like a little bit higher coverage of bra, maybe like a booty short, and a 1 would probably be more like pasties and like a bikini situation on the bottom. I kind of run right at a 2, which is just kind of like a standard bikini, I would say. And I don't really deviate from that anymore. But the idea with this category would be maybe lower coverage of clothing equates to more tips. The next category we have is it a special holiday or not? I also included days where it doesn't necessarily fall on the actual holiday, but people would still be celebrating it that weekend. For example, on here, Valentine's Day was on a Monday, but I still considered it a special holiday because people would probably be celebrating Valentine's Day that weekend. This category I thought would be interesting because it could go one of 2 ways. 1, people are going to be out more often on special holidays. therefore people will be tipping more. Or some holidays people want to stay home for, like Christmas, so less people will be out, less people will be tipping. But there's a weird effect that happens in terms of the amount of people that are there and how much we are getting tipped. Sometimes when there are barely any people in the club, the people in their kind of sympathy tip, as what I call it, they kind of feel bad for how empty the bar is, but also they get to have a more intimate night and get more attention from us. So they feel compelled to tip more, tip larger bills. On the other end, when it's super, super crowded, sometimes people just see that there's a large crowd and feel that they don't need to tip. They just assume that someone else is going to take care of that for them. But everybody kind of has that mentality in their brain that night, so we end up getting tipped less. I thought this category would be interesting to include to see, do special holidays mean that we get paid more? Like actually. Next category, we've got time spent upstairs in minutes. We have 2 stages that we perform at. One's downstairs, one's upstairs. And upstairs is kind of chronically known for not being able to make a lot of tips. The downstairs stage, the focus of that bar is us on the stage. With the upstairs bar, we're kind of there as aesthetic background environments. Your focus isn't really going on us. That being said, sometimes that does create an environment of more intimacy, so you can interact with the customer a lot more intimately. They might pay you more. I personally find the upstairs bar very hit or miss. All right, next category is, am I wearing heels? Again, this category was kind of pointless because I consistently wear boots with heels on them. I've gotten really comfortable with them. I kind of created this category at a time where I was alternating between those heels and like tennis shoes, like a Converse style looking thing or like a Vans. Moving on to the next category, how many other dancers? I thought this was interesting because again, it could go one of 2 ways. One, if there are more dancers, the tips have to be split amongst us more. But the other contributing factor is if they're scheduling more dancers that night, it is probably a busier night, so there's just going to be more tips in general. And the last category that we have here, I know this is a lot of pretense, is am I wearing a mask or not? And I kind of added this category at the last second. I didn't realize that it could be a big contributing factor on whether or not I make tips. A big part of this job is connecting with the audience, and facial expressions, knowing the words to songs is a big way to do that. If I'm wearing a mask, people might not feel as connected to me and might feel less inclined to tip me. With that all being said, let's get into the actual data because this is just a bunch of numbers and it might not be very helpful to just look at this. Let's go into the first category, how do I feel? The point that I highlighted is my first day back this year. I assumed I would be kind of rusty despite how good I feel, which proved true. It is one of the lowest amount of tips that I made this year. Actually, it is the lowest amount of tips that I made this year. On the right, you see all of that data plotted out, and you can see with that trend line, it does indicate that the better I feel, the more tips I'm gonna make. It's not that stark of a slope, and I think that's probably because of a couple of outliers. I think with more time, this trend line will be a little bit more concrete and not so random. Let's go into the next category, whether or not it's a holiday. So there's a bunch of different graphs here. So the bottom left bar graph is just the total amount of tips. I feel like that's not really helpful because there are just so many more regular nights that you work. So that's just gonna bring in a lot more money than holiday nights. On the top right, that is the average amount of tips. And honestly, there's not a big difference in average of tips. The non-holiday days are slightly less than the holiday days, only by about $6, which is not that big of a percentage. And then on the bottom right, I showed what percentage of tips come from holidays. Not super indicative of anything really. I was honestly really surprised that the amount of tips that I make on holidays is not that much more than the days on non-holidays. I felt like there might be a couple of outliers kind of muddying that data, so I made a different bar graph. So in this bottom bar graph, I took out that one data point that was really, really high, the day that I made $177 on a non-holiday. And that definitely made the bars a lot more different. It's a difference of about $20, which honestly makes sense. Most of the holidays that I will be working people are gonna go out holidays, New Year's, as well as Valentine's Day weekend. The one that would kind of take away from it would be Christmas. And also for the Christmas holiday, I think the sympathy tip effect kind of happens where there's not that many people in the bar, so the people that are there feel a little bit more compelled to tip us. I think that's all I have to say for this category. Let's go into what I call the upstairs data. So the top graph has all of the data plotted, and you can see that there is a slight trend line of the more time that I spend upstairs, the less money I will make. But there are a couple of outliers that really skew and muddy the data, mainly the one where I worked 0 time upstairs. That was Christmas, not a whole lot of people there, so they closed off the upstairs bar entirely. And again, this other point where I made a weirdly high amount of tips of $177. So I decided to take out those outliers and put them in a separate graph. And this lower graph shows a much clearer trend line, more time spent upstairs, less tips made, which kind of proved what I already had a feeling of. Basically, you're going to make a lot less money, if any money, at the upstairs bar. So the more time you spend there, the less money you're gonna make. Not that we really have a choice, because we do have to work the upstairs bar at some point in the night. But yeah, not a whole lot to go over here. Let's go on to the next one, which I thought was pretty interesting. This is other dancers data. Basically, how many other dancers are there and how does that factor into the amount of money that I make? My two theories were either, one, more dancers means less tips because the amount of tips in total gets split. Other theory was that more dancers indicates busier night. Therefore, there's a total amount of tips that is more. There was a slight trend line saying that the more dancers there are, the more tips that you would make. This is a slight trend line, so I think this will become clearer as time goes on. And there weren't really any outliers in this data. I know that $177 amount does seem kind of like an outlier, but I tried plotting it again, taking that point out, and it didn't really change the trend line at all. This would be an interesting data set to keep an eye on. And I didn't include this when I was originally explaining the data, but this table represents pre versus post-pandemic. I know post-pandemic isn't exactly the correct terminology to use right now because we're still dealing with COVID. So here you can see it's divided into post-pandemic and pre-pandemic. The post-pandemic number is like $9 or $10 less than pre-pandemic. It's not that huge of a difference, but it is a difference. I would say there's a few contributing factors to that. One, people don't carry cash as often. Two, a lot of people lost money, lost jobs. Maybe they just don't make as much money as they used to. Three, people aren't going out to bars or clubs as often. Now, a point in the opposite direction indicating maybe they would actually tip us more, and also might be an indicator as to why my tips aren't horribly low post-pandemic, is that I think in the pandemic, we kind of developed an attitude of supporting both small businesses that involve women and people of color, and sex workers, which are also kind of in a marginalized community. So yes, I think my overall amount of tips went down because of the previous factors that I mentioned. I think there are some people that are still trying their best to support people like me and continue to tip. And I know I mentioned the category of wearing a mask or not. I only have a few data points for that, so I'm gonna keep that one going and we'll revisit that one next year. I think I might get rid of the heels category altogether since I'm basically wearing heels every single night. And I'm probably also going to get rid of the coverage of clothing out of 3 category just because I pretty much consistently wear a level 2 coverage every single night. But I think the other categories would be really interesting to watch as years go by. And who knows, maybe I'll add other interesting contributing factors. Maybe I will also add a category of like first night back. I do leave this job for a number of months and come back, and like I tend to be kind of rusty that first day. So I feel like it'd be interesting to look at my first day average versus my rest of the time average. And also feel free to comment any contributing factors that you guys would be interested in seeing. I know this maybe was one of my drier videos, but I find all this data really fascinating. Again, I'm like a huge numbers nerd, and I hope you guys found it fascinating as well. If you liked it, make sure to like the video. Please subscribe if you've been here for a while and you haven't subscribed. Comment on any categories that you would like to see added to this, or whether or not you found this data helpful, insightful, fascinating. I will do this in future years, and I hope you guys stick around to see that. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.